When your family members, your daughters, are being converted or...
So I want to touch on grooming a little bit. And someone like Tommy Robinson from the EDL.
Yeah.
You know, he's built up a massive following. And it's very strong against grooming.
Yeah.
And he calls out a lot of people. A lot of people thinks he's a racist. In fact, he has probably done some racist things in the past. But it's quite similar, not what you're doing, but you're calling out people who are grooming. You know what I mean? What's your thought on someone like Tommy Robinson?
You see, with Tommy, he went through different stages in his life where he got to know different people who had used him and abused him. You understand? I went through pretty much similar situations. I think he's got to that point in his life where he's realised what his path is. You understand? People are quick to say, "Oh, yeah, but he's like this, he's like that. Oh, he used to be part of this, he used to be part of that." You understand? All right, maybe he did. You understand? Maybe he was brainwashed. You know, maybe I used to fucking chop people up for a living. You know, maybe I used to kidnap people for a living. You understand? I don't know. Everyone's got a past. You know, I used to just give people shit for no reason. You know, if I was walking down the street and someone was looking at me, I'd just beat them for no reason. You understand what I'm saying? But, you know, that's just, everyone changes. You understand? And I don't know, the guy's trying to do something, rather than just kind of take the piss out of him for what his past was, just try and work with it. You understand? Maybe he's realised.
How do? I'm not entirely sure of Injection's body of work when it comes to calling out grooming or tackling this issue, but I do feel he's misunderstood Mr. Robinson. I'd imagine any work that Mr. Injection's done concerning groomers is more faithful and street-based, in that he would confront the groomers and stop it at source by tackling the groomer. But when it comes to Mr. Robinson, all he's done is look at local and national newspapers, and he's seen that there's a grooming gang trial taking place. Thus, he turns up to the court with a camera crew in tow, filming the groomers going into the court to get sentenced. That gets dishonestly styled as exposing the groomers or exposing grooming gangs, which is obviously not true, right? They've already been exposed. That's why they're in court. That's why they're going into court. They've been caught. They've been exposed. So that's all a bit disingenuous. Likewise, it gets styled as a media cover-up because many of his followers don't really understand contempt of court rules and reporting restrictions. So whilst the trial's going on, there's always reporting restrictions in place because these trials are linked, so they don't want the media to jeopardize the trial, meaning the media can't report on the trial in depth during the course of the trial. Mr. Robinson's followers don't seem to understand that, so they make out that Mr. Robinson's doing this massive service that the media are unwilling to do, even though once the convictions come through, these grooming gangs get put on front page news by the media. So it's clear that the media are reporting on it, but there's a bit of a grift and agenda when it comes to Mr. Robinson vis-a-vis grooming gangs. That explains why there's a lot of misinformation coming out from his camp to propel him as some sort of hero or exposer of these gangs, and the media as biased in favour of these gangs. You've got to bear in mind, when Mr. Robinson pulls off these court tricks, he makes it about himself, live streaming it as a gonzo journalist, which aids his grift. It helps his grift in getting donations from viewers who don't really know better. In addition, these stunts he pulls impede court proceedings and or potentially jeopardize trials. This has been reported in the media as well. On top of that, there's the grooming survivors and support groups which have distanced themselves from Mr. Robinson, condemning him as somebody who is really using their suffering for his own agenda and his own purpose, which is really money generation and a Zio agenda against the Muslim community.
Sammy does not support Robinson. Sammy Woodhouse says Tommy Robinson is selective in which cases he chooses to focus on.
Firstly, given what you just mentioned about Tommy Robinson, I've had the privilege to speak to hundreds of victims, and not one of them has said that the far right explored what they went through and exposed what they went through. This is nothing to do. They simply exploit the situation.
Another, who was raped by a number of different men, she said, "I don't see him marching against my white abusers."
So much so that some of them just completely lied. Remember the Huddersfield grooming gang? The ringleader was a Sikh lad, right? They literally lied about that fella. They made out that he was a Muslim when he was a vile groomer, but once he got caught, then he converted to Sikhism, which is completely not. It was debunked and denounced by the Sikh community, the family of the groomer who got caught. You've got to ask yourself why the Tommy Robinson cabal made this up. Why did they portray the Sikh groomer, who was the head of the gang, as a Muslim? Why did they do that dishonestly? So in short, when it comes to Mr. Robinson, he uses the grooming gangs as well as the victims to promote a Zio agenda targeting Muslims, which he makes money out of, ultimately meaning he's profiteering from this situation. There's a reason why he's dressed up in Gucci and living in £1 million house, whilst contrast that with Mr. Injection's work. Now, like I say, I haven't seen any body of work from him. I'm just going by his word, or the word of the interviewer, saying that he's doing some work against, well, indicating that Mr. Injection's doing some work against groomers, and that's great. Well done. If you're targeting grooming gangs, that's great. But let's contrast that so-called body of work that Mr. Injection's done with Mr. Robinson's. One would be done for the good of the community and the well-being of the victims. That would be Mr. Injection's body of work, whilst Mr. Robinson's body of work would be more to do with self-promotion, money generation, and an agenda of demonization. I would also suspect Injection is anti-drugs, and this is somewhat related indirectly to grooming gangs and criminal activity, other criminal activity.
No matter where I've gone in the world, I score. I'll show you tonight. As soon as we get in this pub, I'm going to record it for you. I've gone to Qatar, pub. I've gone to Doha. The school gear of the sesh while they're all praying. I've gone everywhere, mate. Everywhere. Every city I've gone to. When we went to Germany for the World Cup, I was like, see you lads. Where you going? I'm going to find out. And then that's it. We're on. So
purchasing from drug dealers can indirectly be funding other crimes carried out by gangs, and some of those crimes may include stuff related to trafficking. The trafficking of young females. Mr. Robinson claims to have bought drugs from everywhere he's been to around the world. So who knows what type of criminal gangs he's been funding? We just don't know, right? So every time he's scoring, quote unquote, scoring around the globe, he's funding a criminal gang, perhaps. Like I say, who knows, he may have indirectly given money to gangs involved in trafficking women in his efforts to score. Just to touch on a bit of a concern, because when I listen to some of the Sikh narratives or Sikh rhetoric around grooming gangs, this is a bit of a concern. Remember, lads, grooming is not when a Sikh lass and a Muslim lad date at a university or college, and or the Sikh lass is thinking of actually converting to the Muslim faith. That's not quote unquote grooming. That's nothing got to do with grooming gangs. That's just interaction between two young people, right? That's not anything to do with grooming gangs. Let's keep that in mind.
It's gonna hit your family. You know, when your family members, your daughters are being converted, or, you know, this stuff that's going on where they're going on to drugs and shit like that, then you guys are going to be ringing us lot up. I get phone calls all the time. Women being converted, children on drugs, children on alcohol, children doing this and that, and they want us to help. We can't help if you can't help your own children. You understand? Yeah, be a pillar for your children, for your family. If you guys can tomorrow set an example and a good example, your children, your family around you will follow.
I say this as a reminder because I did hear Mr. Injection say conversions, the word conversions, and it does bring in play Dr. Katy Sean's research into a narrative which is spread amongst the Sikh community about forced conversions, which is not supported by evidence, by the way. It's not supported by evidence.
So the forced conversions narrative is embedded within the British Sikh diaspora, and all my respondents interview record this story and subscribe to the various plot devices it entails. The prologue of the book actually introduces readers from the start to this particular discourse, as it's central within this conflict. Such a narrative continues to circulate despite a lack of evidence to support its claims. It's a cautionary tale which describes the threat of Muslim predators lurking on university campuses, ready to lure vulnerable Sikh girls into the folds of Islam through disguise and manipulation.
On top of this, there is a Sikh man who goes around talking about grooming. He's Mohan Singh of the Sikh Awareness Society, but in one of his talks, he seems to be calling a Sikh class falling for a Bangladeshi lad at a university. He seems to be calling that grooming. Well, that's what I'm getting from the clip that you can listen to, and we'll play that in a few moments' time. In fact, we'll finish off with that clip, but before we do so, let's just touch on Katy Sean's work. She's a Sikh lady, a Sikh academic, who's investigated what is a cautionary tale which lacks evidence. So there's a cautionary tale which gets spread across the Sikh community about Muslims targeting Sikh classes. Again, there's no evidence for it, but it gets spread across that community. It looks to me as though it's more of a case of men from the Sikh community who don't want Sikh women dating Muslim men, and hence the spread of this cautionary tale or this narrative.
Although the context has dramatically changed since 15th century India, the overall structure of the narrative has not. That is, in such discourses, the figure of the Muslim always remains as the principal enemy. The two key discourses in which this antagonism between Sikhs and Muslims in the contemporary context centre around are what I define as the forced conversions narrative and mistaken identities. So the forced conversions narrative is embedded within the British Sikh diaspora, and all my respondents interview record this story and subscribe to the various plot devices it entails. The prologue of the book actually introduces readers from the start to this particular discourse, as it's central within this conflict. Such a narrative continues to circulate despite a lack of evidence to support its claims. It's a cautionary tale which describes the threat of Muslim predators lurking on university campuses, ready to lure vulnerable Sikh girls into the folds of Islam through disguise and manipulation. And the basic stages which were continually repeated are as follows. So first, Sikh girl is away from home and family. As she goes to university or college, she gains her independence and freedom and starts going out drinking and clubbing. Muslim man befriends her disguised as a Sikh. He uses a Sikh name or wears the gurdwara and even drinks to fool the girls into thinking that he is Sikh. According to this narrative, the Muslim man is also given an incentive for every girl he converts. It's often said that there's a cash prize and a secured place in heaven, despite his drinking. They form a relationship where the girl's groomed, they fall in love, and when emotionally attached, he reveals his true Muslim identity. The cracks begin to show, and if she's being pressured to convert to Islam, family ties are cut and she's trapped. She tries to escape, but compromising photos have been taken of her to use as blackmail, or she's impregnated, thus can't risk shame in the family. Finally, she's beaten up or taken to Pakistan to work as a prostitute, and no one ever knows of her whereabouts. So this narrative framework can be seen articulated by the respondents I interviewed. For example, someone said, since I've come to university, I've heard from my mates in Birmingham and Leicester about Muslim guys trying to convert Sikh girls. They've told me Muslim guys will go out, wear the gurdwara and even wear a turban and have a fake Sikh name. And then when they go out, they'll chat to Sikh girls and stuff. And then the Sikh girls will obviously think they're Sikh guys, and slowly they'll get manipulated. And this was quite a common theme emerging. So the central element of the forced conversions narrative is the idea that Sikh societies are somehow subverted or threatened by Muslim powers to comply with these predatory practices of Muslim men. Such a narrative works to reproduce the historical antagonisms, and it's a tale, I argue, to rescue the Sikh community from moral decay. And although it may or may not be true, it re-engages, stabilises and regulates the community through the articulation of a fear. Within the story, we see the elaborate production of the Muslim enemy, whereby Islamophobic themes of the depraved and lecherous Muslim is prominent. Consequently, the Islamophobic vision of the Muslim other threatening the purity of Sikhism is cemented.
A reasonable bit of speculation would be, let's imagine the relationship between these Muslim students, male students, and Sikh students, female Sikh students develops, and then they start talking about the idea of marriage. More often than not, I'd imagine that the Sikh women convert to the Muslim faith, and that could possibly result in some sort of divide between them and their family, their Sikh family. Perhaps it's a matter of them being disowned, and within the Sikh community that family would propel the idea that their daughter was groomed, hence why she's no longer in the household and they're no longer in touch with her. I think that could be a reasonable bit of speculation, and it would be great if academics like Dr. Sian or others would investigate this. Perhaps Mr. Injection Singh would do that, who knows, but it is something for us to look into, because you don't want to be conflating the very criminal act and the vile act of grooming gangs with general dating at college, okay, or university, and in some cases marriage between Muslims and Sikhs. The good news about the grooming gangs is it looks like the police and the authorities are right on top of this now. There's no news of new grooming gangs coming out, which is brilliant. That's fabulous. And all the convictions that you're seeing in the news nowadays pertain to historic crime. They're nabbing people for things that they did 10, 15 years ago in grooming gang activity, which is good because they're being brought to some level of justice, and it's an indication that there's no new grooming gang crimes taking place, meaning perhaps we've eradicated this problem. That is great news. Of course, it's not good news for everybody, right? The grifters, the Ziosivnak cabal, such as Mr. Robinson, are going to struggle to earn their crust now. How are they going to afford the next Gucci belt? How are they going to afford the next Gucci belt without the use of the emotions around the idea of grooming gangs operating and the false narrative that these individuals are doing something to stop it? Focus should be applied to this new problem where folks like Mohan Singh of the Sikh Awareness Society seem to be conflating the very serious and the very criminal act of grooming gangs with cautionary tales about Muslim men who are getting into relationships with Sikh women.
Now, when she moved to East London to university on, I think it was Queen Mary's. She went from the Midlands into London, and within 3 weeks, she was approached by one of these religious shoshpas. When we got involved, and when we got involved, we went to see the Bengali. And we just couldn't understand, how the hell did she fall for this guy? You see the tawa? And you think, how the hell did this guy manage to take this young lady, and within 3 weeks he was able to manipulate her, able to get into her head, able to get into her heart. It took us 1.5 years to get that girl back, but this only took him 3 weeks to do.